Welcome back to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. On today's episode, my conversation with Momo Vuyisich. Momo is the co-founder and the chief science officer at Viome Life Sciences. He founded Viome after more than a decade working for the U.S. government studying the microbiome in a laboratory. He was also inspired to found Viome due to his own personal health challenges. I often say that public health is personal, and Momo's experience is a clear example of that. After seeing firsthand the role that the microbiome plays in human health and the development of chronic disease, he became curious and passionate, and he used that curiosity combined with his skills and education to found Viome. Viome is a direct-to-consumer health company. It allows people at home to take measurements of their gut microbiome, their oral microbiome, and their blood, send them into Viome, and get back reports that help them understand the status of their health and how to make improvements using modifications to the microbiome, as well as, most importantly, diet. Momo and I covered many interesting topics, and I know that I learned things during this episode, including things about the importance of the oral microbiome and the role that it plays in health and the onset of disease. So please enjoy my conversation with Momo Vuyisich. Momo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have you here, away from the cold, sterile environment of LinkedIn. We're here in sort of person in this much more lively space of the internet. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of everything we're going to talk about, I always like to hear a little bit about how people came to discover the unique field in which they work. And especially in your case, I'm pretty sure that as a child, you weren't thinking, I'm going to be a microbiome scientist. So I would love to hear a bit about your journey and what you thought you might be when you grew up, and then at what point along the way the microbiome and all the related health influences entered your vernacular.
Yeah, I'm going to compress that long story into it was a combination of first having an autoimmune disease when I was a young man, starting in grad school, that no one could diagnose, no one could treat. Just basically, my body was consuming itself. Very, very terrible situation. The second was my disillusion with the academia and pharma. Finishing my PhD and thinking that the scientific community as a whole, meaning the academia and pharma, are there to improve humanity's health. I realized that's not the case, that they're incentivized by completely different goals. Academia is incentivized by papers. Whether those papers make any impact on human health makes no difference. And pharma does not want to cure any diseases. That's not their business model. They want to actually just manage diseases. So those were sort of the main factors in my career to realize that I want to do something different. So back when I was suffering from my autoimmune condition, I thought a lot, I read a lot, and I realized how the human body functioned and how it evolved with the microbiome and how it's basically living on chemical communication, that our immune system doesn't have eyes or brain or ears. You can't talk to it. It only listens to the chemical signals, and these chemical signals come from either nutrition directly or via the microbiome or via products of our own genes, but it's all chemical communication. And so back in 2010 or so, I basically completely reset my scientific career and decided I want to become a systems biologist, or I want to focus more on that, because I had microbiology experience, biochemistry experience, and then cell biology and protein engineering and like a whole bunch of things. I was like a jack of all trades. And I just wanted to put all that together and become a systems biologist, which is exactly what I think I am today. And that comes with understanding human physiology, understanding microbial physiology, and then very importantly, being an analytical biochemist, because if you can't measure what is going on inside the human body, what is healthy, what is not healthy, and how can you tune things, then you can't really affect our health. And so all those pieces came together in about 2010. And then for about 6 years, I worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory to develop the technology, which is a laboratory technology and bioinformatic technology that powers my company today. And uh, solved sort of the foundational problems that I was captivated by. And then in 2016, we spun out, we licensed all that from Los Alamos National Lab and spun out Viome.
Amazing. And did Los Alamos know that they were doing microbiome research, or they were just interested in learning how to examine bacteria and other organisms?
Yeah, so Los Alamos National Lab's priority is nuclear weapons. And so biology exists there as a very sort of fringe science. And the entire organization doesn't really pay too much attention to what exactly scientists are doing. So you have sort of free will to do whatever you'd like to do. But in reality, you can only really do what you're funded to do because you have to get grants. Los Alamos doesn't just give out money to scientists. So I had to get soft money to cover the salaries of myself and all of my staff and to pay for all the research supplies. So for 6 years, in 6 years, I was able to get close to $50 million in grants, which was quite an extraordinary achievement. And the way I designed the platform from the beginning was to improve planetary health. It was not very specific to human health. It was really planetary health. I basically figured that every single biological system in on Earth has interacting partners and interacting microorganisms and macroorganisms. And there's this chemical communication. And if we understand the biochemistry of that ecosystem, we can understand how it functions, what are the perturbations, how we can keep it healthy, and so on. And so when we started developing the platform over the 2 or 3 years, it was basically a very generic platform for any ecosystem in the world. And in fact, the first publication that came out of my team's effort was on soil microbiology, and then cancer biology, and then host pathogen interactions. So it has a wide variety of applications. But really, what we're doing at Viome is we're applying it specifically to human bodies. And so we've focused on that. And that's, I think, where the biggest breakthrough needs to be made. And I go by this mantra that a sick person only has one dream. Their entire life is consumed by one dream, and that is to get rid of this disease, right? And a healthy person can have many dreams and can go, realize many dreams and have the freedom of time, and they can do whatever they want, and they can be productive members of the society, and they don't suffer. And so if we can solve the huge health problem or disease problem we have today in today's world, I think we're going to solve hundreds of downstream problems that this chronic disease epidemic is causing.
I totally agree. And frankly, we have very similar backgrounds. I also had autoimmune conditions that inspired me to say, hey, like, the whole medical field is failing me. I'm showing up to the doctor and I'm like, "Hey, I feel horrible. I can't stop itching. I'm 18 years old and I can't run because my joints ache." And they're like, "I don't know, your cholesterol and blood pressure look great. Have a nice life."
That's
And
it.
that really wasn't enough for me. So that's how I ended up getting curious about the microbiome. Now, I didn't start a microbiome company. Shame on me. But I'm so excited that you did. And I want to get a bit more into Viome. Although, a quick side question, because I am also very passionate about this conversation about the soil microbiome. Is there a potential commercial operation like a Viome for farmers to look at their soil and get a better
No.
understanding of the microbiome there?
No, we still have many, many, many years until we solve all chronic disease problems for humanity, including cancers. So right now, that's just not even on the table at all. For pets or animals or soils or water ecosystems or air, any of those are built-in. I would love to solve the built-in environments problem because we have a massive mold infestation in many buildings, both residential and commercial. And people, I think millions of people have mold related problems, and that's just completely sort of fringe science. No one's really paying attention to that. It's very complicated. And same as what happened to you and me, people with mold illness, they go to the doctors and they're like, everything looks normal. There's nothing wrong with you. It must be in your head. And that's really unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I've done a couple different episodes where I chat about the microbiome, but I would love for you to kind of give the listeners your big picture overview on the role that the microbiome is playing in chronic disease specifically, and how you see the next 10 years or the near term future of manicuring and healing the microbiome as playing a major role in, as you just said, healing this epidemic of chronic illness and many of the downstream societal ills that we see.
Wow. Okay, so you just opened up an 8-hour topic, and we've got a few minutes. So, I would say I would distill it down to a few key takeaways. First key takeaway that I want to everyone to understand is that the gut microbiome is not the absolute most important thing to every chronic disease, right? So if someone says we are a gut microbiome company and we're going to solve all problems, that is a false statement. If someone says we're a genetics company and we're going to solve all your problems, that is a false statement. If someone is an immune system company and they say the same, it's a false. Or nutritional company, okay? You have to be a systems biology company, meaning you have to look at nutrition, you have to look at the environment, you have to look at the gut microbiome, oral microbiome, for women, likely vaginal microbiome, and then you have to look at the immune system, the hormones, the heavy metals, the mycotoxins, the inflammation. And then you have to look at the nervous system, and that includes what environment do you live in? Are you stressed? Or do you have anxiety? Is your workplace causing you, mental health and cognitive issues? If you don't take all of these pieces into account, you're not going to keep people healthy. Everyone else who is focused on any one of these pieces is just at best solving a part of the problem. So to me, the key is don't be focused on gut microbiome. We started as a gut microbiome company, but now we're far more than that. Our, basic test is a gut microbiome test, but we'd love all of our customers to be able to afford the full test, full body intelligence, which includes stool, blood, and saliva. And that's our flagship test that, half of our customers are currently taking. So we'd also love to add food sensitivities to profile the immune system. We'd love to add hormone tests and metal tests and all of that, but all of that adds up and costs add up. And so right now, the biggest challenge is how do you bring the most value to the most people? That's really what we have focused on as a company. And we thought starting with gut microbiome would be that. And then we expanded into saliva and blood. We might expand soon into food sensitivities and then later into hormones and metals and mycotoxins and all that. But all of that just adds costs and people don't have unlimited sources of funding. Um, so that would be a takeaway. Look at the whole body. Second takeaway, which is super important, is that literally everyone has focused on the composition of the microbiome. Everyone has asked the question, which microorganisms are associated with a disease and which ones are not? And that's the old way of thinking in the infectious disease area. People just assume that, depression related to gut microbiome is going to be like cholera. If we find Vibrio cholerae in your gut microbiome, you probably have cholera. And if we don't find it, you probably don't have cholera. And that's just not the case with microbiome and chronic diseases. Chronic diseases are the result of many, many, many different factors. And I already included a bunch from all these different areas, but even just in the microbiome. So let's zoom in and give a specific example because we just published a preprint of that and we're going through the peer review right now. But actually, let's give an example of a paper that we published last fall. This is a peer-reviewed article on our scores and IBS. And so I wanna just point out the following. When you molecularly measure the functions of the microbiome, you can actually see hundreds of functions of the microbiome that are related to a disease and others that are related to health. And even if you fixed one of these completely, you would still have the disease or you would still be healthy, meaning that you have to really shift an entire balance, like a population of biochemical functions. And so there are two keywords there, a population, meaning many factors, and biochemical functions. I didn't mention bacteria, I didn't mention specific names. And so that's really the key, that there isn't one magic bacterium that's going to fix a disease or that's going to cause a chronic disease. There's going to be hundreds of different ones. So that's a concept that I would like everyone to understand. And let's go to the most sort of elemental example of that that I like to give. And that is, if you want to make beer, you're going to provide two things. You're going to provide a yeast, so brewer's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and you're going to provide it with a molecular ingredient that it can use to feed itself and produce alcohol, right? If you provide barley to a yeast, it'll make you beer. If you replace that yeast with something else, like some bacterium, or a different kind of yeast, you may not get beer. And if you replace barley with some other kind of a food, you may not get beer. It's really the combination of the two, specifically, that gives you ethanol. Now, let's talk about ethanol. Ethanol in the context of beer is a byproduct of the yeast, and most people love ethanol, which is why beer is so popular. But in the context of if that microorganism was in the gut microbiome and you fed it a certain molecular ingredient and it produced some molecule, the question is that molecule that it produces as a byproduct, is it good for you or is it bad for you? That's really the key question. And so for scientists, these are called secondary metabolites or compounds or molecules. For common people, I would say we can call it micropoop, right? It's basically what microorganisms secrete that they can no longer use as an energy source. And so we have co-evolved. So here's another takeaway. We as humans, and so has every other animal on the planet, we have actually co-evolved with microbes to depend very heavily on this micropoop, meaning that microorganisms in our oral cavity, in our gut microbiome, they are making secondary metabolites or micropoop that signals our body to maintain health. And without those metabolites, we would not be healthy. And so we have evolved not to develop our own genes to signal ourselves, but to actually depend or rely on microorganisms to do that. And so let me give you a specific example. We know people who get sick repeatedly, and we know people who almost never get sick. And when we learn the immunology lesson on T cells and B cells, we say, well, there's these memory cells, and they're supposed to remember when you got COVID once, why am I getting COVID again, right? And so the way it works is T cells that respond to COVID, they're these cytotoxic T cells, and they're going to be killing the SARS-CoV-2 virus that's infecting you today. And if you do not provide a chemical signal, those cells will die. And next time you get exposed to COVID, you'll get sick again because your system did not remember it. However, if you have a certain microbiome in your gut, in your colon, and if you consume specific fibers to feed that microbiome, they will produce butyrate. And butyrate is that magic chemical signal that goes into the bloodstream and basically literally tells cytotoxic T cells, hey, you should convert to memory T cells. You should remember this bad guy. And so butyrate induces cytotoxic T cells to transform themselves into memory T cells, which means that they survive and they stay in the bloodstream circulating for decades. And next time that T cell encounters COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2, it'll immediately wake up, start replicating and defending you so that you don't get sick again. But this mechanism depends specifically on two things: having specific members of the gut microbiome and feeding them specific food while you're sick to produce that chemical signal. How cool is that?
It's so cool. And something that I love, truly love about the microbiome is how messy it is. I've said this before, but I think our culture is addicted to like black and white answers. Like they want things to be good or bad, yes or no. I won't say any other colors, but basically, people love two sides of something. They want to believe that it's either good or bad. And the microbiome really teaches us that broadly speaking, it's much messier than that. And people will often come to me and say, what probiotics should I take? And I'm like, well, listen, I can tell you what probiotic makes my body feel good based on the diet that I'm consuming. But I don't eat fast food. I don't eat food coloring. I don't drink diet soda. I don't drink regular soda. So I don't actually know what metabolites are going to be produced if you pour processed, like ultra processed junk foods into a gut microbiome containing the bacteria that I consume. It could be really bad. I know that when I eat my high fiber whole food diet, it works really well, but there's not even really a magic pill answer that can work broadly across the board for every person because I don't know what you're going to be feeding those probiotics, and it might not turn out well. And also, of course, everyone's body's a little bit different. And I was coming from behind. I'm a big believer in probiotics because I had a really unfortunate childhood full of antibiotics. And so I'm doing a lot of replenishing work to stabilize and keep everybody happy in there. But, not everyone has that same story. So it's such a nuanced conversation, which again points to the importance of a company like yours, which really leans into that nuance and gives the consumer, each individual, the opportunity to learn about their own body, to learn what's happening inside of themselves, and also to get feedback on not just who's in there, like you're saying, but what the function of those bacteria may or may not be, and also what their diet may be doing in terms of interacting and creating these secondary metabolites for good or for bad, depending. So, can you speak a little bit more about how Viome is empowering individuals to take control of their health using the information that comes from your products?
Yes, so all of our tests include results and recommendations. And results are lists of things we found. And that's not so important. What is important in the results is the scores. So we have 68 currently, 68 consumer scores. And these are sort of high level consumerized scores that are tied to inflammation and tied to microbial health and gum health and all of that. But what sits under those consumerized scores are hundreds of what we call R&D scores. And let's talk about what a score is. And we published a paper last fall that basically breaks down the entire process of how is it that we make these scores, and we reveal one of the scores completely. We open the hood, and you can see exactly what the components of the score are and what is the math behind it. And let me summarize that. So a score is a number that is the sum of weighted factors. Weighted factors means that each factor has a different contribution to that sum. So they're not they're not all equal. And so in sort of let's say a simple term, let's say that we don't have this score for Alzheimer's disease. We don't have any scores for any disease. But let's say an Alzheimer's disease score would depend on, do you have high activity of gingipane production? These are toxins produced by Porphyromonas gingivalis in the oral cavity. So that would be a heavyweight score, because if you don't have that, you're unlikely to have Alzheimer's. Do you have a leaky gut? That would be a factor. Do you have high LPS production, the pro-inflammatory LPS production in the gut microbiome? And do you have a blood-brain barrier that's leaky or that is not leaky? And those are like 4 or 5 factors that each one of them contributes, and each one of them has different importance, and they would add up to a risk for Alzheimer's disease. What we have is, if we pick any score, let's say uric acid production score, we have typically tens of microbial pathways that we can quantify with our test, and the activity of that pathway is multiplied by this weight or a factor, and you just add up a bunch of these pathways for uric acid production and uric acid degradation, and the sum basically leads to how much total uric acid is on a continuous basis made in your gut microbiome. And we have that, like I said, for 68 different kinds of phenomena, and that's all in the app. And so people can see where they are relative to the rest of the Viome population. Are they in the optimal range or suboptimal or not optimal? And then the computers at Viome, the AI at Viome basically tells them exactly what they need to do. So now we move into recommendations. The computers, based on these scores and based on the answers that people have provided, which tell us what diseases they have and what symptoms do they suffer from at the moment, and demographic, age, sex, BMI, the computers will then make very personalized diet and supplement recommendations. So every customer gets dietary recommendations, and that means that all foods are grouped into one of 4 categories. The lowest category is avoid foods, meaning you should literally never eat them. And then the 3 categories where you should eat them are minimize, enjoy, and superfoods. So minimize foods you should eat. They contain nutrients that your body needs, but you should eat small amounts. And I'll get to that in a minute in my own example. Enjoy foods are, lots of foods that you should enjoy that contain nutrients that will feed your microbiome, and your microbiome will produce beneficial secondary metabolites for you. And then superfoods would be a few foods, anywhere between, let's say, a few to maybe 20, depending on the person, that you need to consume a lot of. And that's because you have some kind of a restriction or deficiency where you need to make up for that. And so, for example, if a typical person has, let's say, 10 to 15 microorganisms that can produce butyrate, this very beneficial compound, they don't have to have a lot of superfoods because you can just enjoy foods, and some of those foods will hit people's microbiome, will provide nourishment for their microbiome, and they'll produce plenty of butyrate. But if you've taken a lot of antibiotics, if you've been eating food that has chemicals, if you've been eating artificial sweeteners, all those things that you listed earlier that would basically remove a bunch of members of your microbiome, and now you have maybe 2 or 3 members that can produce butyrate. Now we need to overcome that by really overfeeding those. And so if arugula has the right polysaccharide to feed your microbiome, the computer is going to say, you need to eat a lot of arugula or potatoes or whatever it is, right? And that can be further restricted if the food that you need to consume in order to feed your microbiome for the benefits is also bad for you in some ways. So let's say the computer says, well, you need to eat a lot of soybeans because they have the right fiber to feed your microbiome and produce butyrate. But soybeans are high in oxalates, and your microbiome just happens to have lost members that can actually digest oxalates and protect you from them. Now the computer has to make that trade-off, and it'll make the best trade-off it can. And sometimes it'll move ingredients from foods to supplements. So then some of those prebiotics will go into the supplement formula and so on. So the computer has to make a lot of choices, and it makes the best choice given the situation. So today, unfortunately, we cannot tell someone, hey, your microbiome is very depleted. You don't have keystone species that would be beneficial for you. Just go order 30 different strains of microorganisms that will have those functions. Unfortunately, we don't have that choice. Besides the lactose and bifidose that have been traditionally there present, we now have only maybe 2 or 3 probiotic strains, and we don't have some key ones. And so that's sort of the limitation, but the computer does the best it can. And so in terms of supplements, the computer recommends some number of supplements, let's say 20 to 30 per person, and it tells the person which supplements they need to take and in what amounts. And that's basically the basic service that everyone receives. And then from there on, people can expand beyond stool tests to saliva and blood. And beyond that, if you get 30 supplements that you need to be taking in certain amounts, instead of you spending a lot of time and money finding those, you can actually order those supplements from us. And we have a $5 million robot that's the size of like 5 school buses that will actually pick individually those supplements that you need in the amounts that you need, put them together and ship them to you. And this actually turns out to be less expensive than if you try to hunt them down. And obviously it's super convenient. So we have that service for supplements, for gut biotics, and for oral biotics. And oral biotics and supplements are actually found in lozenges and toothpaste. So we have all this now, a nice mixture of products to feed both the oral microbiome and the gut microbiome.
That's amazing and very exciting. I want to talk a bit more about the oral microbiome, but before we go there, I had a couple like big picture questions still about this kind of basic general population understanding of the microbiome and the way that it interacts with diet and the role that all of that is playing in, let's just say, the immune system, but our overall health, right? So, for example, um, COVID-19 breaks out, everyone is home panicking, and alcohol sales and processed food sales just went through the roof. And I was sitting at home thinking, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. So, can we talk a little bit about how you would hope that in the next few years, the average consumer might come to understand the role that their diet, in collaboration with their microbiome, is playing in their immune resilience and their ability to withstand and overcome contagious infection?
Yeah. That's a big topic, but I'll summarize some key points. So first of all, we need molecular testing so that after you do something, you can see that it's actually made it better. This is like having a gauge on any kind of a device where you say, oh, the gauge is now in orange or red. I need to do something about it. You do something about it. And if it goes back to green, you're like, wow, that worked, right? Versus I'm guessing. And so one of the biggest problems I think in nutritional sciences today that we're trying to solve, and we are solving, is this sort of generic advice: eat healthy. And then when you ask, well, should I drink coffee or not? And different people will give you different advice. Should I eat red meat or not? Different people will give you different advice. Dairy, you pick anything you want, and there's different advice. And so then you're like, so what is healthy? So that's one big problem that we need to get away from, that these generic advices where Mediterranean diet is best for everyone or ketogenic diet is best for everyone, that is all false. All of it is false because it assumes that all humans are the same, and we're not the same. We will respond to different foods differently.
Like, how do you hope the average consumer would come to understand the role that their microbiome and their diet are playing in their resilience against infection?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, speaking of COVID, but that same essentially rule applies to influenza and other very bad infectious diseases. So, number one predisposition for or risk factor for COVID and influenza is age. As we age, our immune system basically slows down. So, how can you support the immune system? And your gut microbiome definitely is a part of that, but also your weight is a big part of that. So the higher body fat, the lower your immune system efficiency is. And thymus is actually sort of a central key point, a key place where the immune system is trained to fight infections. And thymus basically turns into a fatty organ instead of an immune organ as we gain weight. So age, you cannot do much about, but you can slow down aging by exercising and by eating healthy and all that. Second is body weight. So pretty much the same thing. You need to exercise and you need to eat healthy and not eat what you listed, which is high sugar foods and high fat foods and ultra processed foods and alcohol and all that. And then blood sugar is actually a big risk factor for COVID and influenza. And then pro-inflammatory signals, where the immune system basically overreacts and starts to clot the blood, is also a big risk factor. And so let's talk for a bit about blood sugar control. So we basically, nutritional sciences or nutritional scientists established this thing called the glycemic index for all foods many decades ago. And that glycemic index has been used for decades to recommend people food, but it is flawed, and it is majorly flawed in that that glycemic index applies to an average human. And if you have a room with 100 people in it, not a single one of those people is that average. So it doesn't apply to almost anyone. And the reason for that is because if two people eat the same food, they can have dramatically different blood sugar spikes. And so if you don't know that, if you don't have your own data and just follow the average, you can actually make mistakes. So at Viome, we actually early on in our company, we invested many, many millions of dollars to understand what are the microbial signals and what are the human parts of the physiology to determine this blood sugar spike. And we developed a machine learned algorithm that is now used for every single customer results and recommendation, where we can tell people exactly what foods to eat and which ones to avoid or minimize based on how high the blood sugar is predicted to be spiked by those foods. And so, going back to your original question, you can use personalized nutrition to slow down aging. You can use it to reduce your body fat percentage and increase your lean mass percentage. You can use it to reduce inflammation because we understand what are the pro-inflammatory signals that the microbiome is generating. I mean, there are a lot of them and a lot that are known. There are still many, I'm sure, there are unknown, but we're going to learn those and incorporate over time. But right now we know enough to where we can do that. And then blood sugar control, if you can reduce the blood sugar exposure, like you said, people were drinking lots of canned soda, and that's counterproductive for COVID. That gives you actually more severe symptoms, which is why this country didn't do so well with COVID, and many other, developing nations did better because they don't load up on sugar every day. So that's
Right.
kind of the shortest version of the answer I can give you, but boy, that's a big topic.
It is. And I want to go back to something you said about having a gauge, because obviously, we're talking about using monitoring of certain kinds. And of course, there's things like gut tests and blood tests and CGMs and different ways. But our body does have gauges kind of built in. But I think as a culture, as a people, we've lost our ability to read those gauges. So, for example, like hunger is a great is a great example of this. Like the average person is like, oh, I'm hangry. I have to have a candy bar just to get me over the hump. And obviously, that's not really what the body is necessarily trying to express to them from within. So, my question for you related to this is, do you have any broad advice for when someone is trying to transition to a healthy diet and they feel like their gauge is giving them a negative signal? So I'll give two examples. One is someone is trying to go from a high processed food diet to a whole food, low glycemic, let's say, broadly speaking, diet, and they're experiencing headaches and pain and fatigue, and that feels bad. How might they conceptualize that and why they're feeling that way? And then the related sub question is, let's say someone has been eating a low fiber or high processed food diet and they're trying to transition to repair their microbiome, but they notice that certain foods give them gas, let's say. And we've all heard of, I think we all have, like the low FODMAP diet, right? Which can be used therapeutically when someone is having chronic issues, but which long term might actually steer someone away from a lot of beneficial foods. How might someone reconceptualize the overproduction of gas or bloating that they might temporarily experience when moving from a processed food diet to a higher fiber, higher FODMAP diet?
Yeah. I mean, huge topics. In summary, I would say that there are two cases to generalize it. I would split it first into two cases. One case is a group of people who have not lost the keystone species in the microbiome, meaning their microbiome can be functional and keep them healthy. And for those people, they can tune their microbiome based on either Viome tests or a combination of Viome tests with like food sensitivity tests. They can also do some heavy metal and mycotoxin tests, maybe some hormones. And then they can either play around with their diet on their own. They can use logging methods, or they can hire a nutritionist. I mean, today you have all the tools to do it on your own, and you can basically test. If you get bloated, you can ask yourself, okay, what have I eaten in the last 24 hours? You have a record of that. Then now going forward, you're going to avoid one of those things and see, and over time, learn basically what is causing the problem with your body. So I think that's a much easier case. There are now tests that you can use that can guide you, and enough information and tools online to where if you have maintained a healthy microbiome, I think that's a much easier case. And if you get a headache, it just depends. The complexity of that answer is very high because it depends on so many factors. If you get massive migraines every day while you switch to that diet, that's not good. But if you get some headaches or discomfort, maybe muscle your way through it and see if that was just some kind of a reaction initially, but it settles in, right? So it's a personalized choice. And then the other case I think is far more challenging, and that is where you may have keystone species that are missing in the colon, that need to be there to keep you healthy, and you may have overgrowth of biofilms in like the small intestine, where they might be causing all kinds of issues. And now that's a much larger problem. I think that at that point in time, you really need to fundamentally say to yourself, you know what, I'm going to reset the whole thing. And I was there, by the way, as a scientist. Unfortunately, I traveled all over the world, including I worked in Africa heavily. And so I was on antibiotics prophylactically for 3 years. And so that depleted my microbiome severely. And so I had to take really, really dramatic actions to restore my microbiome, rewild it. And so what I did is I picked up organic farming, and I went to nature without washing my hands. I would eat with my hands completely. And for organic farming, I basically would pull out a carrot from the ground. I would just shake off like the major soil, like major, but there would still be like a gram or two of soil on the carrot, and I would literally eat it there. And lettuce, when we water lettuce, soil sprays all over it. So we would pick lettuce. Actually, we still do that today. We eat lettuce from our garden every single day. And there's clearly soil on that lettuce, and we just put it in the plate, and there's soil there, and we eat it. So those are some major things, but then you have to also stop taking antibiotics and stop consuming foods with all kinds of chemicals in there, including things that they say to preserve freshness, but they're actually essentially antibiotics. So for those people, I would say rewilding the gut should be a number one step. And then maybe in parallel or maybe a little bit later, try different foods, try different tests, experiment more and see how this whole thing, it's going to be an evolving process. You can't rewild your gut in a day. It's going to take probably several months or maybe even more than a year. So during that process, try different things. It's going to be a trial and error. And yeah, it's a journey, unfortunately. There is no quick fixes there. But going back to your original question, there is no doubt that there are some rules that everyone can apply without all this personalization and all this hard work. Some rules are don't eat processed foods. I mean, I'm not even talking about ultra processed. I mean, why would you buy a tapenade that has ground up olives? You have no idea whether those olives had tons of mold on them and they just blended it and served it to you, and you're eating mycotoxins by spoonfuls. Why wouldn't you just get olives that you can see with your eyes that they're whole, and then maybe grind them up with a fork if you want a tapenade, or blend them in a blender? It takes 30 seconds, right? That's one of many examples where why would you do that? So buying foods that you can see with your eyes, that's like the key to me to not introducing bad things. And then doing tests as many as you can afford. And let me give you one example that I recently experienced with Viome. So I talked a bit earlier about oxalates. So oxalates are plant toxins that can poison our kidneys. And my oxalate metabolism. So we have an oxalate degradation score, and that means that we can quantify microbial metabolism that uses oxalate as an energy source and degrades it. And my oxalate score has been good for many years until recently. Recently, it went into suboptimal. It went from optimal to suboptimal. And the computer automatically placed soybeans and black beans into my minimize list. It went from enjoy to minimize, and my lentils and my chickpeas went from enjoy to superfoods. And the computer basically told me, hey, you are now low in oxalate degradation. You need to switch from soybeans and black beans to chickpeas and lentils. And because I'm mostly vegan and I used to eat tofu essentially three meals per day, that was bad news for me. But I said, okay, I trust this test, of course. I mean, we're measuring the biochemistry of the microorganisms. This is bad for me potentially. I went to the kitchen for a weekend and I experimented with making tofu from lentils and chickpeas. And I succeeded. And not only that, but my family and I like tofu from lentils and chickpeas more than the original soybean tofu. We like it better. And
Mm-hmm.
so now once a week, I'll do a meal prep of tofu from 2 to 3 kinds of lentils and chickpeas, and we'll store that in the fridge and it'll last us a week and we can make our meals. And now I know that because my oxalate degradation metabolism is slowed down, I can basically overcome that by making personalized food choices to minimize soybeans and black beans and maximize lentils and chickpeas. And that there's no possible way that any other test in the world could have told me that, because no other test measures the ability of my microbiome to degrade oxalates. And this is the case with hundreds of different things that we have in our metabolic profiling of both oral bacteria, oral microorganisms, and gut microorganisms, but also how the human body responds to those, because we measure so many different biochemical pathways in human blood.
And in that example, which I love because it's so, unique and specific, and you're responding right to this test. In addition to changing your diet, was there anything that you took on from a microbial standpoint? Are you consuming different probiotics? Are you eating different fermented foods? Is there any way to upregulate your oxalate degradation?
Um, No, there are currently no oxalate degrading microorganisms available as probiotics, and that's one of those examples that I gave you. There are several companies that are trying to bring it, but based on our data, um, there are many bacteria that can degrade oxalates, and it's possible that by introducing a single oxalate degrading microorganism, if that microorganism gets its food from other more energetically beneficial sources, it may actually not degrade oxalates, first of all. And second of all, if you're taking one probiotic, it's going to be very challenging to actually colonize it and maintain it there. So those are all challenges with these individual probiotics. My recommendation always that I have followed myself is rewild your gut, bring that diversity to your gut so that you have many redundancies. I compare our body to airliners a lot, and this is just another example where you can compare. You cannot build a jumbo jet that has one system for rudder movement, because if that one system fails, 400 people will lose their lives. You have to have a quadruple system, redundant system for moving that rudder, so that if the primary hydraulic system fails, you have other systems to kick in. And we need to be robust like that. You can make your body resilient and robust by having redundancies. You don't want to have Faecalibacterium prausnitzii as the only producer of butyrate, because if it finds other food that's more beneficial for it, or if it goes away, you don't have butyrate, and you don't want to have to rely on that one microorganism. You want to create a diverse, resilient microbiome, both in the oral cavity and the gut microbiome.
Yeah, and I love that term rewilding. It's funny because apparently you and I have been living strange parallel lives, because I have almost that exact same story of like maybe 12 or 13 years ago, I read something about the microbiome because I was really deep in it at that point, trying to figure out how to feel better and make my microbiome more robust. And I was reading about soil, and I went to the farmer's market and I bought a dirty carrot and I just ate it, just like a soil covered organic carrot. I was like, yep, there she goes. So
Yeah.
I have had that same experience, and I continue to do that. Actually, I just had a dirty farmer's market carrot this past week. So hopefully everything in there is staying wild, getting wilder by the day. And I do now because I think the microbiome, I mean, you and I spend a lot of time thinking about it, especially you. But even for those who spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about, and working with the microbiome, the oral microbiome is still kind of a new topic. And your company, Viome, has just introduced some very exciting oral microbiome products. So I would love to hear you speak a little bit. First of all, give a quick overview for the listener about the oral microbiome, and then what Viome is doing to both better understand the oral cavity and the role that it's playing in health in general, and then also what these new awesome products are able to do for people.
Yeah, again, huge topic. So let's do some sort of takeaways and summary. So oral microbiome is very important for maintaining our oral health and systemic health. Oral health would include things like tooth health and gum health. And it turns out that gum health, just like the lining of the gut that we call leaky gut, leaky gums can lead to disease. And actually, mechanistically, it's been shown that oral bacteria can translocate via leaky gums through the bloodstream and leaky blood-brain barrier into the central nervous system, and very likely cause Alzheimer's disease, whether that's the single source or one of many causes, which I think is a more likely case. We now have this sort of mechanistic journey of a bacterium that lives in our oral cavity, causing Alzheimer's disease likely. So that's one example. And there's Fusobacterium nucleatum that can also travel from the oral cavity via the bloodstream and potentially either cause the onset or progression of certain cancers and potentially cause preterm birth. But these are just some of the examples. And so I would like everyone to think of oral microbiome can be healthy or not healthy. So there's a nice group of microorganisms that can keep you healthy if you feed them the right foods. And their function is twofold. One, to keep you healthy, meaning prevent pathogenic or potentially pathogenic microbes from taking foothold and producing toxins for you. So they're defending basically your health. And the second thing that they're doing for you is that they're providing some very important biochemical or metabolic functions. And so let's talk about those two in examples. So in the one example, if Porphyromonas gingivalis basically outgrows and starts producing these gingipain toxins, you can have periodontitis and gum disease, and that's like a risk factor for a lot of things. The second example I want to give is the blood pressure reduction. I don't know if most listeners know this, but there's a compound called nitrate that is common in leafy greens and root vegetables. And if you consume leafy greens and root vegetables, which are rich in nitrates, those nitrates will enter the bloodstream in the small intestine. And then salivary glands actually concentrate that nitrate and push it out into saliva. And they, again, this is an example of coevolution. We've co-evolved with oral microbiome to help us with this process. So oral microbiome processes these nitrates into nitrites, which travel to the stomach, and the gastric acid from the stomach converts nitrite into nitrous oxide, or NO. And I encourage everyone to read about this because this is such a core piece of human biology that regulates things like blood pressure, which is like a risk factor for a slew of really bad chronic diseases. And it's a simple thing that in most ways can be fixed by specific nutrition and avoidance of PPIs. And so again, you consume nitrates, oral bacteria convert into nitrites, stomach acid converts it to nitrous oxide, which reduces your blood pressure. Now, where are the failure points? If you use mouthwashes, well, first failure point is if you don't eat leafy greens and root vegetables, you're not getting nitrates. So even if the rest of the system could work, it has nothing to work with. So you have to consume leafy greens and root vegetables. And those two things, those two food types are not very popular in the United States. People don't like leafy greens and
They're
root
missing
vegetables.
out. They're really
I
missing
know,
out.
but they're feeding their body the nutrients that we have evolved to depend on, because we used to pick leafy greens from the ground and eat them and dig up roots and eat them. That's how we evolved. We didn't evolve by going to a restaurant. The second part is if you've lost your bacteria that are converting nitrates to nitrites in the oral cavity because you've been taking antibiotics, or you've been eating foods with preservatives, or you have been taking mouthwash, you have been using mouthwash, or using chlorhexidine for rinsing, all of those things can kill your bacteria, which means that, whoops, even if you consume nitrate, you don't get nitrite. And then the last but not least, if you're consuming PPIs, these are stomach acid reducers, you're going to not have stomach acid, which is required to convert nitrites into nitrous oxide. So if any of these pieces are missing, your blood pressure can go high, and it's an epidemic in the United States. I mean, it's something like, I don't know, significant percent of the population has blood pressure that's high, and that's like one of the highest risk factors for cardiovascular disease, for strokes and heart attacks, for kidney disease, all kinds of things. And so if people can just maintain their oral microbiome, if they can feed their body and nourish it with nitrates from green leafy vegetables, and this is particularly important for older people because 50% of nitrous oxide is made by the oral microbiome, but 50% is made by our own genes. But as we age, that process slows down. So you have to depend more on introducing nitrates into the diet. So as you're aging, you should be eating more leafy greens and more root vegetables. So you see how complex this system is. Food has to have certain nutrients. It has to go to the gut, be absorbed in the blood. Saliva extracts nitrates, puts it into saliva. Your microorganisms, in specific microbes, process it into nitrites. It goes into stomach acid, which is natural, and you need it. It processes into nitrous oxide, and you calm down. Your blood pressure comes down, and you minimize risk to all these chronic diseases. If you break that entire chain anywhere, you don't get the benefit. So it's a very complex system. It's just one of many, many examples.
And so your newest product is a toothpaste, and I recall there's a different one for morning and night. Are the
Yeah.
toothpastes probiotic? Are they prebiotic? Are they both?
Yeah, so the gel that is recommended to be used in the morning, the main purpose is to remove biofilms. So
Mm.
it has components in it. I think we revealed them on our website. It's a chelator and MSM, so you can read about that. And there's fantastic literature showing that these compounds will break up biofilms, which is very important to break up biofilms, because once you have a biofilm, that can set in gum disease and caries and so on. The purpose of the evening toothpaste, which you're supposed to use after you've eaten all meals and ready to go to bed, basically, is it has prebiotics and it has postbiotics and a whole bunch of supplements, and they're all personalized. So everything's personalized based on the person's oral microbiome. So you have to do our test in order to know what's good for you and in order for the computer to compute what is it that you need. And so you're supposed to nourish your oral microbiome with these ingredients, and then you're supposed to swallow the toothpaste because it actually also nourishes your gut microbiome. So it does a double duty. So it's the first toothpaste that you brush your teeth and then you swallow.
Wow. That's actually a mental hurdle for me. I felt myself respond to that. Like, I can't picture swallowing toothpaste, but
It's a new world. It's a new world.
it's a whole new world. Ever since we're like 6 months old, it's like, "Don't you swallow that toothpaste. Don't you
That's right.
swallow it." And
That's
now
right.
it's like, "Oh, okay. No, go ahead and
That's right.
swallow it." So
Because yeah.
so just a quick side from this, a little controversial, but what do you think regular toothpaste is doing to the microbiome? The toothpaste with like the hyper colorful swirls and sparkles and
Yeah.
all kinds of amazing ingredients. Is that
Yeah. I mean,
hurting?
I haven't seen any evidence that current toothpaste, like, normal toothpaste you buy at the store, are hurting the microbiome. The mouthwashes for sure do. I mean, mouthwashes, I mean, they're already proving I mean, there's already literature that shows that if you take a mouthwash for 7 days, your blood pressure goes up statistically significantly. Why
Wow.
why why are people why are still people using it? Because the commercials say that it's good for you, right? I
Yeah.
mean, my dentist did a simple, a simple cavity, and she said a cavity fix like a filling, and she said your gums will heal faster if you take chlorhexidine. And so she prescribed me chlorhexidine. And yes, your gums will heal faster because that chlorhexidine kills all bacteria in your mouth. But then it's been shown in a randomized controlled trial that 7 days of chlorhexidine use increases your blood pressure statistically significantly because you're killing the bacteria that are making that nitrite for you. So you've co-evolved with these buddies of yours for millions of years, and now you're killing them, and you don't get the benefit that they've provided you for millions of years. So we have to really switch to a new mode of thinking that these bacteria and all these microbes are there to help nourish us and help us maintain our health. They're not there to be killed. And so that's a hard one because the commercials are saying otherwise. And if the dentist says, guess what? Most people will follow that. I didn't, of course, because I can read scientific literature, but we really need to educate people and they need to realize that this is what's happening.
Yeah, I will never forget. I went to a translational microbiome conference about a year and a half ago. And, I'm a healthy consumer, but I'm not at the very forefront of oral microbiome health. And there was this moment in the room when one of the speakers like made a joke about mouthwash, and the whole room just cracked up. Like, to all these microbiome people, the idea that anyone would use mouthwash was hilarious. Like the punchline to a joke, and they all got it. And I was looking around like, oh, I am going to throw away all my mouthwash apparently because everyone in this room clearly knows something that I have not yet heard. But I will
Yeah.
say that I recently took my child to the dentist, and the dental hygienist told her to rinse with salt water and not to use
Wow.
alcohol-based mouthwash. She said
Wow.
specifically that alcohol-based mouthwash was too harsh and would damage her gums, and that she should stay away from it. So I was pretty impressed by that.
That is pretty impressed. And I think that that came out probably more than a decade ago that alcohol was bad, which is why now companies have come up with all these other mouthwashes that don't have alcohol, but they're still doing damage in that they're indiscriminately just wiping out all microbes. And many of the microbes are helping you digest food, helping you maintain your health, helping you maintain your gums. And if you wipe those out, and they balance the microbes that produce, you know, uh, acids that degrade your teeth, so you're protecting your teeth as well. And so, killing indiscriminately any part of your body is bad just by default, unless you're about to die and you just have to do that, right? If you have a strep throat and you're like or you have some kind of a pneumonia and you're like in a life and death situation, okay, that's okay to use antibiotics. But otherwise, yeah, this mouthwash is basically an antibiotic, but it's not called an antibiotic.
Right. Okay, well, Momo, I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm going to enter like a lightning round to just ask a couple quick questions before we wrap up. My first question is, what, if any, role do you think that public policy should be playing in shifting this conversation? And this question obviously comes from my own bias, working in policy and wanting to advance health and nutrition policy. But I see companies like yours as disruptors who are working to advance this field and putting a lot of money and time on the line to do so. And yet, we know as a society that change is needed. And as you hinted to earlier, all these tests and, going outside of the regular doctor patient visit to find these tests and seek them out and understand them, it costs time, it costs money, and the average American may not have that time or money. So, do you see a role, if any, for public policy in shifting this narrative, shifting our approach to nutrition and health?
I don't think so. I think that it's not going to do any harm, but I think it's going to have marginal effect. I think today people are more rely on social media and influencers and articles and blogs than listening to what the government has to say, right? And so if the government said, mouthwash is bad for you, and even if they do that, it'll take them years to come to that conclusion, but they'll have to say why it's bad for you. And if they said it's because it has alcohol content, right? The companies are immediately going to go and say, oh, we don't want to put alcohol, but we'll put other antibiotics in there. And now we're going to market it as mouthwash, but this one's good for you. And it'll take the government 5 to 10 years to then have enough studies and have enough evidence that this is bad for you. And the cycle just keeps going, right? So to me, I think in terms of how can we affect the public the most, it would be really good from first grade to educate kids on how to actually derive conclusions from the vast amounts of information that's online, right? To me, that would be the most important thing. And if you don't do it in the first grade of elementary school, pick a grade that you think kids are smart enough to go read. If they simply ask a question, is mouthwash good for you or bad for you, they can go read 10 different sources and make a conclusion. You know what? There isn't maybe strong evidence that this is really bad for me in the short run, but there's really no good reason to take it, and I'm not going to use mouthwash, something like that, right? So I think education would be far better. But again, that's a complicated issue, maybe even more complicated than public policy. So I don't really have a good answer as to what we need to do, except what we are doing at Viome. So I was at the government and I didn't want to go into public policy. I didn't want to become an influencer or, a writer. I really just wanted to solve the problem, empower people and show them with hardcore data that they are in fact improving, and that's going to solve the problem.
Yeah. I guess my only thoughts on a policy impact would be for access, right? I mean, do you think that just as a company, at a certain point as you scale, you'll be able to reach more consumers who have less purchasing power?
Absolutely. So we are not going to stop working 24/7 until everyone in the world has access to free Viome services. Free. So that's our goal from day one, is that this must be available to everyone. Now, how are we going to achieve that goal? We're going to achieve that goal when two things are met. The process is cheap enough and it comes to a certain price point. And second, when we run enough randomized control trials and develop health economic models to show that if you invest X dollars into Viome for a person during their lifetime, you're going to save 10x or 100x dollars in their healthcare. The moment that we show that is the moment that every payer, whoever that is, that can be a self-insured company or a vertically integrated insurance company, or majority of the time it'll be national healthcare systems like in Canada, Australia, England, and so on. They will actually pay for Viome for every citizen because they know with mathematics that that's going to lower their healthcare expenditures. And we're already at the point where national healthcare systems are breaking because they cannot support the management of chronic diseases and cancers. And so we have to focus on prevention. And when we show that it's true, and then it'll be paid for, and then everyone will have free access to everything that Viome does. So that is the goal, and we're literally, I'm not kidding, working every single day to both lower the cost of the whole process, and second, to run randomized control trials to test how well the process works so we can build these health economic models.
That's awesome. And, I guess even though you shy away from the policy solution, I do hear in your answer that policy will end up playing a role because ultimately you'll need public private partnerships, and there is a lot of healthcare provided by governments. So some sort of policy that takes into account healthcare spending over the short and long term, hopefully will soon come to acknowledge the role that diet and the microbiome are playing in this expensive epidemic that we're having of chronic illness, especially in the US, but increasingly it's one of our greatest exports, the US diet and US rates of chronic disease. So, in closing, I would just love to hear from you. Um, where do you see this in 5 to 10 years? Do you think that that's the time frame that we're going to have this big societal impact? Do you think that we're going to be reaching more and more consumers? And where do you hope things will be in 5 to 10
Yeah,
years?
I think in 5 to 10 years, this will be free to consumers. It'll be funded by the taxpayer dollars as true preventive medicine, where personalized nutrition is preventive medicine. It's recognized as that, and it's based on the data. It's not based on some speculation. And then what we really want to build is an app, which we already have, and it has a chatbot built in, but it's going to be an AI personal assistant. And this AI personal assistant, which we're beta testing right now for some things like recipes, but this personal assistant, we call it Vi, V-I-E, so Vi. So it'll be Chef Vi and Coach Vi. So we're building Chef Vi right now, but Coach Vi will come next. And so Coach Vi, you will simply say, hey, Coach Vi, I'm at this restaurant. What should I eat? Or, hey, Coach Vi, I'm coming home. I want to make Thai food that is good for me and my husband or me and my wife. What should I make? And Coach Vi will tell you exactly, you have these groceries at home. You need to pick up these groceries and and I'll guide you through the recipe. Or, I need to make dinner for four of us, including two children. And Vi will know the test results for all four people. And it'll say, you know what, you need to make two versions of your meal. The core will be the same, but these add-ons will be different. And it'll be 30 minutes and you're done. It'll guide you through fasting, whether to do it, how to do it, when to do it, for how long to do it. It'll guide you through exercise, what type of exercise, when, scheduling, taking all your measurements from like from the health app and keeping track of those and adjusting on time, and then guiding you through sleep. When should you go to sleep? How long should you sleep? Critique your sleep and help you improve. So all diet and lifestyle choices that you need to make every day in order to age very healthy will be included. So that's the vision, and we're building pieces of that as we get data. All of that costs time and money. We're not a profitable company yet, so we have to grow big and have enough money to invest in this. But all of this, the best news is none of this requires some kind of a technological breakthrough that's science fiction today. Everything that I just mentioned exists today. All we have to do is just do it. And it requires time and money and obviously very talented people. But it's not something that if you wanted to do this in like 1970s, you would have to say, well, we have to wait until these technologies become developed. You can't do it today. We can dream about it and you can write a book about it. But today we can actually execute it. And that actually brings me to a point that I want to make that you didn't ask me about, which is, if there are audience members and they're wondering, wow, this is amazing. I want to help do this, right? Like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to listen about it. I want to actually do something about it, right? This really should be a movement. It should not really be a Viome only focus and mission, because we have 100 employees. I mean, we can only do so much and we have so much money. This really should be a world problem that the world should take in. And so if you're sitting somewhere and thinking, well, how can I help? Well, here are specific cases where you can help. You can help educate people, learn about the importance of diet and nutrition, and educate your friends, educate your family. You know, you can just do that grassroots. If a million people started talking about, hey, when you go to the grocery store, read the label and call me if you have a question about something, right? And I'll tell you, or here are some tricks, like don't take polysorbates, don't take benzoates, just little things. So education, grassroots education, that's very important. Second, if you're in any kind of a scientific discipline, basically shift your focus from whatever it is that you're doing to asking the question, what can I do in the next year to improve human health? And that does not mean working with human cells. That does not mean working with mice. That means working with humans. And that's such an important thing that we have millions of studies done in mice. And the only conclusion I can draw is, well, I have no idea if this would work in humans. So that was kind of a waste, right? The third thing you can do is if you're an administrator and you're like, well, this sucks. I'm just an administrator somewhere at a university. What can I do? Oh, you can do a lot. You can enable scientists to actually perform this kind of work that's meaningful and relevant to human health. You can go and talk to the IRB committee at the university. You can talk to the managers of the IRB committee and shift their mindset from easy no's, saying, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. The reason we're doing so many cell culture and mouse studies is because IRB committees are choking the scientists by simply saying, you can't do this in humans. You can't do this in humans. The IRB committee's function should be not to stop science, it should be to enable science. So work with the scientists to come up with solutions. Don't just say no. And so even if you consider yourself to be just like a mid-level administrator at a university, you can actually make a big impact. It's not going to be, you're not going to change the world this year, but over a period of 5 to 10 years, you can actually contribute to it. And what I'm calling is millions of people who have these roles. You just contribute a little bit, and if millions of other people do the same, we're all going to make big progress. And then as a consumer, you can contribute to this field hugely by making choices at the grocery store. Make the choice to not consume sauerkraut that has been treated with sodium benzoate, which means they may have fermented it or not, but even if they fermented it, they added sodium benzoate to that sauerkraut so that it can stay on the shelf for 4 months. And that sodium benzoate not only killed the bacteria that fermented the sauerkraut, but they actually are going to kill the bacteria in your oral cavity and in your intestines. And you think you're getting a probiotic meal in sauerkraut because everyone says sauerkraut is probiotic, but in fact, you're destroying your own microbiome by consuming a product where the company said, well, we're going to save money by making a product that's shelf stable for 6 months and it's cheap, and you're going to buy it. Make a commitment to not buy the cheap products that are bad for your health. And as a consumer, speak with your wallet and stop buying those products so that the companies are forced to come up with products that are good for us. And to me, everyone can do that. Literally every single citizen can do that. So those are some of the things that I would like at the grassroots level to happen.
Well, that is awesome. And I'm totally with you. Obviously, I am here trying to educate and share this important information with everyone that I can think of. And I'm definitely that friend that people call if they need help reading labels at the grocery store. But I totally hear you. And I agree and believe that every single person can and should vote with their dollar and their attention first and foremost. There's nothing more valuable than the time and attention and money that each individual and organization invests in things. So thank you for saying that, because it's a very powerful way for us to close out this conversation, just reminding consumers about their individual and collective power. I completely agree. And I hope that together we can totally revolutionize the way that the food system and the healthcare system acknowledge and treat and respond to the microbiome and its impact on chronic illness. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you for sharing all of that.
My pleasure.
And thank you so much for joining me today in general. It's been incredible to learn about your own journey. I always say, like, public health issues are always personal. So I love that you have a personal story of battling chronic illness that led you to this field. And I'm sure it wasn't fun, but
I
speaking
don't
as
love it.
well, listen, my friend, I have been there as well, but I'm speaking from personal experience as a fellow autoimmune friend and as a public health consumer, that I am glad that you sort of fought your way through that and came to the other side to innovate the way that you are with Viome, because without that journey, you may not have come up with such an incredible and impactful product that millions of people can benefit from. So thank you for turning your struggle into triumph and for sharing it with everyone.
Love it. Love it.
Thank you once again for listening to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. For more information on me, Marian, please visit my website at marianflaxman.com. For more information on my guest and his company Viome Life Sciences, please find the links in the show notes. This episode was produced by Brain Trust Productions and sponsored by Informed Solutions Consulting. Thank you so much once again for listening, and we will see you next time.